For 7 years, the girl touched her ear and winced. Every specialist said the same thing. Congenital hearing loss, irreversible, learn to accept it. Her father, Julian Hawthorne, spent fortunes. Private jets to Germany, consultations with London's finest audiologists, experimental treatments in Singapore. They all delivered the same crushing verdict. Then Tessa Monroe, a maid desperate to save her dying mother, noticed something no doctor had seen. What she pulled from that child's ear would expose a truth more shocking than anyone imagined. Julian Hawthorne was untouchable. Tech mogul. Venture capitalist. At 40, he'd built Hawthorne Technologies into an $8 billion empire. The kind of wealth that bought islands and influenced elections. His Silicon Valley mansion sprawled across 50 acres with views that made other billionaires jealous. But his 7-year-old daughter Charlotte had never heard a bird sing, never heard her father say, "I love you" out loud, never heard her own laughter echo through those empty halls. Charlotte was born deaf. At least, that's what every doctor confirmed. Julian spared no expense. Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, private specialists who charged 6 figures just to examine her. Dr. Richard Chun, the world's leading pediatric audiologist, examined her personally. Dr. Lisa Fernandez from Boston Children's Hospital ran every test imaginable. Brain scans, auditory processing evaluations, genetic testing. The diagnosis never changed: profound sensorineural hearing loss, bilateral, permanent, irreversible. Accept it. But Julian couldn't accept it. Not after losing Charlotte's mother, Gabrielle, to cancer when their daughter was only 2. Gabrielle had fought for 3 years, wasting away in hospital beds while Julian threw money at every experimental treatment. Clinical trials, immunotherapy, treatments so new they barely had names. Nothing worked. She died at 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, whispering words Charlotte would never hear. "Take care of our baby girl." The guilt consumed Julian. He'd failed his wife. He wouldn't fail his daughter. So he kept searching, kept spending, kept begging God, a God he'd stopped believing in, for a miracle. What he didn't know was that the miracle wouldn't come wearing a white coat and Harvard credentials. It would come with calloused hands and a heart full of desperation. What happened next? You need to see it for yourself. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The Hawthorne mansion stretched across 50 acres of Silicon Valley land. From the outside, it looked like a dream. Georgian columns rising 3 stories high. Floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the sunset just right. Marble floors imported from Italy. Gardens so perfect they looked painted. Tours magazine had called it a masterpiece of modern luxury. But inside, silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels like rest. This silence was heavy, thick, like something had died and no one had buried it yet. Servants moved through the hallways without speaking. Their footsteps were soft, careful. They'd learned quickly. Mr. Hawthorne liked things quiet. No music played in that house. No television noise. No laughter bouncing off the walls. Just silence. And somewhere in that silence, a father was drowning. Julian Hawthorne sat in his study most evenings, staring at the family portrait above the fireplace. There she was, Gabrielle, his wife, her smile frozen in oil paint, her eyes still bright, still alive. Next to her, a younger version of himself, looking hopeful, looking whole. And between them, Charlotte, for years old in the portrait. Before Julian understood that his daughter would never hear her mother's name. Before he realized that all his money, all his power, all his connections meant nothing against the silence that had swallowed his child. Gabrielle died when Charlotte was 2. Cancer, the doctors called it. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. 3 years of fighting. 3 years of hoping. 3 years of watching her fade. Julian held her hand while the light left her eyes. She'd been trying to say something. Her lips moved, forming words he strained to hear. But no sound came out. Just like their daughter. The parallel haunted him. Both of them, the 2 people he loved most in the world, robbing him of their voices. taking their words into silence. Julian never forgave himself. If he'd chosen different doctors, if he'd caught it earlier, if he'd been paying closer attention to the symptoms, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Charlotte would be different. Maybe everything would be different. The guilt sat on his chest like a stone he couldn't lift, growing heavier with each passing year. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He spent money. Millions of dollars. The best specialists on Earth. Flights across oceans. Hotels that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. He took Charlotte to Germany, to specialists who'd pioneered cochlear implant techniques. To London, where audiologists used technology so advanced it looked like science fiction. To Singapore, where they ran experimental procedures that weren't even approved in the United States yet. Every doctor said the same thing. Your daughter's deafness is congenital. There's nothing we can do. You need to accept this. Accept it. How could he accept that his girl would live in silence forever? How could he accept that Charlotte would never hear him say, "I'm sorry your mother isn't here"? How could he accept that every birthday song, every "I love you", every whispered goodnight would fall into the void between them, unheard, unacknowledged, lost? So Julian kept searching, kept writing checks, kept hoping that somewhere out there, someone had the answer. He worked 16-hour days, traveled constantly, buried himself in acquisitions and board meetings, and anything that kept him from looking too closely at what he couldn't fix. Because looking at Charlotte hurt too much. She had Gabrielle's dark curls, Gabrielle's gentle spirit, Gabrielle's way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Every time Julian saw his daughter, he saw his failure multiplied. The wife he couldn't save, the child he couldn't help. It was easier to stay away. Easier to hire tutors and therapists and sign language interpreters. Easier to let professionals handle what he couldn't bear to face himself. Charlotte had everything money could buy. The best education, the finest care, a room full of toys she barely touched. Everything except the one thing that mattered. Everything except him. The irony wasn't lost on Julian. He'd built an empire from nothing. Disrupted entire industries. Changed the way the world communicated. Forbes called him a visionary. Time magazine put him on their cover. But he couldn't help his own daughter here. Couldn't bridge the silence between them. Couldn't figure out how to be a father to a child who lived in a world he couldn't enter. He didn't realize the answer wasn't coming from a specialist. It wasn't waiting in some prestigious medical institution or experimental treatment facility. It wasn't going to arrive via private jet with letters after its name and a six-figure consultation fee. The answer was coming from someone he'd never think to look at twice. Someone who was about to walk through his front door with nothing but faith in her heart and bills she couldn't pay. Her name was Tessa Monroe, and she was about to change everything. Tessa Monroe arrived on a gray November morning. The kind of gray that makes everything feel heavier than it should. She stood at the gates of the Hawthorne estate, clutching her worn duffel bag with both hands, trying to steady her breathing. This was it. Her last chance. At 28, Tessa was beautiful in the way that hard work and harder choices make a woman beautiful. Tired eyes that had seen too much, calloused hands that knew honest labor, a determined set to her jaw that said she wasn't here to play games. The overcast sky pressed down on her shoulders like a weight she was already carrying, like it knew what she was about to walk into. Back in Oakland, her mother was lying in a county hospital bed. Sarah Monroe, 52 years old, stage 4 kidney failure. The dialysis bills were piling up like a tower Tessa couldn't stop from growing. $87,000 and climbing. The number haunted her dreams, whispered in her ear during every waking moment. She'd already sold everything. Her car, the Honda Civic she'd worked 2 jobs to buy. Her grandmother's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry that had survived 3 generations. Even her father's watch, the one he'd worn every day until the heart attack took him when Tessa was 16. This housekeeping job was her last option. For $1,500 a week plus room and board. She'd done the math 100 times, lying awake in the dark. 6 months. In 6 months, she could save enough for her mother's treatment. Maybe even afford a transplant evaluation. Maybe save her mother's life. Tessa didn't care that Julian Hawthorne had a reputation for being cold and distant. Didn't care that the other staff whispered about the cursed household where silence lived like a ghost. Didn't care about the mansion or the money or the Silicon Valley address. She just needed the paycheck. Needed it more than her next breath. But Tessa carried something else with her, something she didn't even realize would matter. Knowledge. Years ago, her younger sister Imani had suffered from chronic ear infections. Tessa had spent countless nights in free clinics, watching doctors examine Imani's ears with those little lights, learning to recognize the signs, the redness, the fluid buildup, the way pain made a child wince and touch the same spot over and over. When they couldn't afford follow-up visits, when the bills piled up and the clinics stopped returning their calls, Tessa had learned to look herself. She'd saved Imani's hearing twice with that knowledge, catching infections before they became permanent damage. She didn't know it yet, but that same knowledge was about to save another little girl. The front door opened before Tessa could ring the bell. A woman stood in the doorway, 55, maybe older, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a pressed uniform that looked starched to military precision. Her face was stern, all sharp angles and sharper eyes that assessed Tessa in one sweeping glance. Everything about her said she noticed everything and forgave nothing. "You're Tessa Monroe?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm Emma Stone, head housekeeper." No warmth in the introduction. No welcome. "You'll clean. You'll stay quiet. You'll keep to yourself. Mr. Hawthorne doesn't like disruptions, especially around his daughter." Tessa nodded. "I understand, ma'am. Do you?" Emma's eyes narrowed, hawk-like in their intensity. Because the last girl didn't. She tried to get too friendly with the child. Thought she could help. Thought she knew better than the doctors and therapists Mr. Hawthorne pays a fortune for. She paused, letting the words sink in. She was gone within a week. No references. No second chances. Tessa swallowed her pride, felt it go down like broken glass. She needed this job. Needed it more than her dignity. "I'm just here to work, ma'am." Emma studied her for a long moment, searching for something, weakness, maybe, or defiance. Whatever she was looking for, she must not have found it because she finally nodded. "Good. Follow me." As they walked through the mansion, Tessa kept her eyes down like she'd been taught. But she couldn't help noticing things. The silence first, thick, oppressive, alive in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of life, the presence of grief, so heavy it had weight and substance. Other servants moved through the hallways without speaking, without smiling, like ghosts haunting a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The heaviness hung in the air like fog that wouldn't lift. Expensive artwork covered the walls, paintings that probably cost more than Tessa would make in 10 years. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases, perfectly arranged, but no one stopped to smell them or smile at their beauty. All this wealth, all this grandeur, and not an ounce of joy. The paradox made Tessa's chest ache. And then she saw her. A small girl sat on the grand marble staircase, surrounded by dollhouse furniture arranged in perfect, obsessive lines. Dark curls fell around her face, wild, beautiful curls that caught what little light filtered through the windows. Piercing blue eyes stared down at the tiny pieces in her hands with an intensity that seemed too old for such a young face. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the footsteps passing by. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements careful and precise, like she was afraid of taking up too much space in her own home. But what caught Tessa's attention, what made her breath hitch and her step falter, was something else. The way the girl touched her right ear. Just briefly, almost like a habit she didn't know she had. And the tiny wince that crossed her face each time she did it. A flash of pain, there and gone, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. Tessa's chest tightened. She'd seen that look before. Years ago. Imani at 8 years old, touching her ear the same way, trying to be brave while pain built behind her eyes. The memory was so vivid it took Tessa's breath away. She didn't say anything. Couldn't say anything with Emma walking ahead of her, already suspicious, already watching. Tessa just kept walking, kept her eyes down, kept her face neutral. But her heart whispered something she couldn't ignore. Pay attention. Emma led her to a small room in the servants' quarters. Plain white walls, a single bed with crisp linens, a dresser with 3 drawers, a window that looked out over the gardens. It was clean, functional. Nothing like the opulence they'd walked through to get here. You start tomorrow at 6. Don't be late. Emma turned to leave, then paused at the door. And Miss Monroe? Remember what I said about the girl. Mr. Hawthorne's rules exist for a reason. Then she was gone, heels clicking down the hallway like a countdown. Tessa closed the door and leaned against it, finally letting herself breathe. She unpacked her duffel bag. Didn't take long. She didn't have much. A few changes of clothes. A Bible her mother had given her. A photo of Sarah in her hospital bed, smiling despite the tubes and machines, trying to be brave for her daughters. Tessa set the photo on the dresser and pressed her fingers to her mother's face behind the glass. Mama, I'm going to save you. I promise. But even as she said the words, her mind drifted back to that little girl on the stairs. Those dark curls. Those blue eyes. That wince of pain no one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they'd noticed once and stopped noticing long ago. The way people stop seeing things that hurt too much to acknowledge. That touch of the ear. That tiny moment of suffering in a house full of silence and wealth and desperate, failing love. Pay attention, her heart whispered again. Tessa sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. She'd come here for her mother. Come here for money, for survival, for one last desperate chance. But something else was happening, something she didn't understand yet. God was putting her exactly where she needed to be. And that little girl with the dark curls and the painful ear? She was about to become more than just her employer's daughter. She was about to become the reason Tessa risked everything. Charlotte Hawthorne's world was small by design. Every morning, she made her way to the East Wing sunroom where natural light flooded through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in shades of gold. There, surrounded by her elaborate dollhouses, 6 of them, each one a miniature mansion more detailed than the last, she found the only control she had in a life that felt increasingly out of her hands. Every piece had to be perfect. The tiny sofas positioned just so. The miniature paintings hung at precise angles on walls no bigger than her palm. The little family figures arranged in rooms that looked lived in, loved in, nothing like the real mansion where she actually lived. This was her escape, her kingdom, the one place where everything made sense because she made the rules. No one bothered her there. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent contract in a house full of silence. The sunroom was Charlotte's, and the rest of the world stayed away. Her sign language tutor arrived at 9 every morning. Ms. Patricia Chun, efficient and professional, all business. She'd sign the lesson plan, Charlotte would respond, and 30 minutes later Ms. Chun would pack her materials and leave with a nod that was probably meant to be encouraging but felt more like dismissal. No warmth, no connection, just another transaction in a life full of them. The occupational therapist came at 11. Mr. David Kim, exercises and stretches designed to help with fine motor skills, hand-eye coordination, things that apparently mattered for deaf children. Charlotte went through the motions because that's what was expected. He never asked if she was okay, never tried to communicate beyond the clinical necessities. Just exercises, a note on his clipboard, and then he was gone. Lunch came on a silver tray delivered to her room. The chef prepared special meals, organic, nutritionally balanced, probably delicious. Charlotte barely touched them. She wasn't hungry. Hunger required caring about your body, about survival, about tomorrow. Most days, Charlotte felt like she was just going through the motions of being alive. Afternoons were for more dollhouses, or sitting by the windows watching the world move without her. Cars driving past on the distant road. Birds flying in formations she couldn't hear. Gardeners working in the grounds below, their mouths moving in conversations she'd never be part of. Life happening everywhere except where she was. The staff avoided her. Not out of cruelty. Tessa had started to understand that during her first week. It was helplessness. They didn't know what to say to a child who couldn't hear them. How do you comfort silence? How do you connect with someone who lives behind glass you can't break through? Some of them whispered superstitions when they thought no one was listening. Tessa had heard them in the servants' dining hall, voices low and furtive. The mother's death took the girl's hearing. She's cursed. Bad luck follows that family. Nonsense, all of it, but it gave them an explanation, a reason to keep their distance. Others just found it easier to pretend Charlotte wasn't there. They'd walk past her in hallways, eyes sliding away, footsteps quickening. Not mean, just easier, less complicated, less heartbreaking. Charlotte had learned not to expect more. At 7 years old, she'd already figured out that people pitied her. She could see it in their faces, that sad, sympathetic look that made her feel like a broken thing that couldn't be fixed. Her deafness made them uncomfortable, made them awkward, made them wish they were anywhere else. Even her father looked at her with sadness instead of joy. Charlotte had stopped trying to get his attention months ago. Every time she'd catch his eye, she'd see it, the guilt, the pain, the wish that she was different, that she was whole, that she was the daughter he'd wanted instead of the one he got. So Charlotte had learned to be small, to not burden anyone, to live in her silent world without complaint, without demands, without hope that things would ever change. But lately something was wrong, more wrong than usual. The pressure in her right ear was constant now, a dull, throbbing ache that never went away. Sometimes it spiked, sharp and breathtaking, stealing her breath and making her vision blur. She touched it constantly, trying to relieve the pressure, but nothing helped. The pain just built and built, a crescendo she couldn't hear but could feel in every nerve. She'd tried to tell her father last week. Caught him in the hallway between meetings, signed carefully. "My ear hurts. Something's wrong." He'd looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, nodded absently, and signed back. "I'll schedule another doctor's appointment." Then he was gone, disappearing into his study, into his work, into the life he lived that didn't include her. Another examination. Another stranger poking at her with cold instruments and colder hands. Another disappointment when they'd find nothing, fix nothing, help nothing. Charlotte had stopped hoping anyone would actually help. Hope was for people who still believed the world cared about their pain. Tessa's first week passed in a blur of repetition. She cleaned floors until her knees ached, wiped windows until her arms burned, folded linens with the kind of precision Emma demanded. She kept her head down like she'd been instructed, played the role of the invisible servant, didn't ask questions or offer opinions. But she couldn't stop watching Charlotte. Every morning, same routine. The girl alone in the sunroom, surrounded by her dollhouses and her silence, arranging her miniature world with obsessive care. Her world was so small it broke Tessa's heart. So contained. So carefully controlled because it was the only thing in her life she could control. Tessa noticed things others missed. The way Charlotte sat by the windows, pressing her small hand against the glass like she was trying to touch the world beyond it. Watching life move without her, always on the outside looking in. The way she'd look at Julian when he walked past without stopping. That flash of hope in her eyes. Then the crushing disappointment when he didn't even glance her direction. How her little shoulders would sink lower each time, like she was folding into herself, making herself smaller, less visible, less of a burden. And the ear. God, the ear. Charlotte touched it over and over, wincing each time, pain flickering across her face in micro-expressions that lasted half a second. And no one noticed. Or maybe they'd noticed once and stopped noticing long ago, the way you stop seeing wallpaper or hearing clocks tick. One afternoon, Tessa was dusting the hallway near the sunroom when she saw Charlotte struggling with a dollhouse furniture piece. A tiny sofa that wouldn't fit through a doorway. The girl's small fingers turned it this way and that, frustration creasing her face, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Tessa knew she shouldn't interfere. Emma's warning echoed in her mind like a prophecy. The last girl was gone within a week. She should walk away. Mind her business. Keep her job, save her mother, survive. But before she could stop herself, before her brain could override her heart, Tessa knelt down beside Charlotte. Gently, carefully, she took the tiny sofa from the girl's hands and turned it at an angle. It slid through the doorway with a soft click, fitting perfectly into the miniature living room. Charlotte's head snapped up. Their eyes met. Tessa's breath caught. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Charlotte's blue eyes were wide, surprised, like she'd forgotten what it felt like when someone actually helped instead of just pitted. And then something happened. Something small but seismic. The tiniest smile flickered at the corner of Charlotte's mouth. Brief as lightning, but Tessa saw it. Felt it like a crack across her heart, splitting it wide open. Tessa smiled back. Gave a small wave, nothing elaborate, just a simple gesture of acknowledgement. "Hello. I see you." Charlotte waved in return. Small hand, trembling slightly, but the wave was there. Real. Intentional. That night, Tessa lay in her small room thinking about that wave. Such a small thing, just a hand moving in the air, a gesture that took half a second. But it meant everything. It meant Charlotte was still in there, still hoping, still capable of connection despite the walls everyone had built around her. Tessa couldn't sleep. She got up, crept down to the kitchen in the dark, found scrap paper someone had left near the recycling. Back in her room, she folded a paper crane the way her mother had taught her years ago. Simple origami, nothing fancy, but made with care. Made with love. The next morning, before her shift officially started, Tessa left the crane on the sunroom table where Charlotte would find it. She didn't wait to see if the girl would take it. Didn't want to put pressure on the moment. Didn't want to turn it into something it wasn't. Just a gift. No expectations. No strings. But the following day, when Tessa came to dust the sunroom, the crane was gone. And in its place, carefully positioned where the bird had been, was a note. 2 words in shaky, unpracticed handwriting. "Thank you." Tessa pressed the note to her chest and closed her eyes. Her hands trembled. Her breath came short. She whispered into the quiet, "Lord, let me help this child. Show me how." She didn't know it yet, but God was already answering. And the answer would cost her everything she had. That evening, her phone rang. Oakland area code. Hospital. "Ms. Monroe, this is Dr. Patel from Highland County Hospital. We need to discuss your mother's care." Tessa's world tilted. "Is she?" "She's stable. For now. But her kidney function is declining faster than we anticipated. Without dialysis, she has maybe 2 months. With continued treatment." He paused. "We need to discuss payment options." 2 months. The words echoed in Tessa's head long after she hung up. 2 months unless she could save enough money. Unless this job worked out. Unless she could keep her head down and her mouth shut and survive long enough to save the woman who'd given her life. But in the sunroom down the hall, a little girl was suffering. And Tessa had just promised God she'd help. She didn't know how to do both. Didn't know if she could. All she knew was that the countdown had started. And time was running out for everyone she loved. Over the next 3 weeks, something shifted in the Hawthorne mansion. Something small and secret, growing in the spaces between silence. Tessa and Charlotte developed their own language. Not words. Charlotte had plenty of those in sign language that no one bothered to learn. This was different. A language of small things, secret things, the kind of communication that happens when 2 lonely people find each other in a world that's forgotten how to see them. Tessa started leaving gifts. Candy wrapped in gold foil, tucked beside Charlotte's dollhouses. More paper cranes, each one folded with care during Tessa's breaks. Simple drawings of flowers sketched on scrap paper. Daisies and roses and wildflowers that Tessa remembered from her childhood before everything got hard. Charlotte left gifts in return. Thank you notes in that shaky handwriting that got a little steadier each time. Drawings of Tessa, crude but heartfelt, stick figures with careful details like Tessa's curly hair and the small cross necklace she always wore. And sometimes, small gifts from her dollhouse collection. A tiny chair, a miniature lamp, pieces of her carefully controlled world, offered up like prayers. But the real language they developed was in signs. Not the formal ASL Charlotte's tutors taught, those crisp, clinical gestures meant for communication but not connection. These were personal signs Charlotte had made up herself, a private vocabulary for emotions too big for standard language. Tessa watched, learned, memorized. When Charlotte tapped her chest twice, it meant happy. When she pointed to the sky, she was thinking about stars, or maybe about her mother, somewhere in heaven, a place Charlotte had been told about but couldn't quite understand. And when she pressed both palms together, like prayer but slightly different, it meant safe. Slowly, gradually, Charlotte started using that last sign around Tessa. Safe. It showed up more and more. When Tessa entered the room, when they sat together during breaks, when the world felt too big and too loud and too much. Safe. Tessa treasured that more than anything. More than the paycheck, more than Emma's grudging approval, more than the small room and the regular meals. That one sign meant she was doing something right in a life where most things felt wrong. Charlotte started waiting for Tessa in the mornings. She'd position herself in the sunroom where she could see the hallway. Watch for that familiar figure with the cleaning supplies and the warm smile. And when Tessa appeared, Charlotte would light up. An actual smile, bright and real, transforming her face from sad to radiant in half a heartbeat. The other staff noticed. Whispered about it in corners. Have you seen the girl smile? First time in months. What's that new maid doing? But no one said anything to Emma. Not yet. They sat together during Tessa's breaks. 15 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon if Emma wasn't watching. Tessa would join Charlotte on the sunroom floor, and they'd arrange dollhouse furniture together, or just sit in comfortable silence that felt nothing like the oppressive quiet that filled the rest of the mansion. At night, alone in her room, Tessa practiced sign language. She'd watched Charlotte's tutors through doorways, memorized the hand shapes and movements. Practiced until her fingers cramped, until the signs felt natural instead of foreign. Basic phrases first, hello, thank you, how are you, then more complex ones. Charlotte taught her the personal signs, showing Tessa how to tap her chest for happy, point to the sky for remembering, press her palms for safe. And one afternoon, when they were alone and the light was golden and everything felt possible, Tessa signed something she'd been practicing for a week. You are special. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. Big, silent tears that spilled down her cheeks. She stared at Tessa like she'd just been given something precious, something she didn't know she was allowed to have. Her hands moved in response, shaky but determined. No one ever said that before. Tessa pulled the girl close, held her while she cried, and felt her own tears falling too. How could no one have told this child she was special? How could she live in a mansion full of people and never hear, never see signed, the most basic truth about her worth? But even as their bond grew, Tessa noticed other things. Darker things. The ear touching was getting worse. Charlotte winced more frequently now, sometimes every few minutes. Her hand would fly to her right ear, press against it like she was trying to hold something in, or push something out. Sometimes there were tears in her eyes from pain she couldn't escape. One afternoon, Tessa rounded a corner and caught Charlotte pressing both hands to her right ear, face contorted in agony. The girl was bent over, shoulders shaking, suffering in that terrible silence that made everything worse because no one could hear her scream. Tessa's nursing instinct kicked in, not professional training, just years of watching over Imani, learning to recognize when pain crossed the line from manageable to dangerous. She'd seen this before. The constant touching, the wincing, the building pressure that made a child's face twist like that. Something was wrong. Really wrong. That evening, Emma Stone cornered Tessa in the kitchen. The other staff scattered like birds, suddenly remembering tasks that needed doing elsewhere. I've seen you with the girl. Tessa's stomach dropped. Ma'am, I don't. Don't. Emma's voice was sharp as glass. I warned you. Mr. Hawthorne has rules. Staff doesn't get close to Charlotte. I'm not trying to cause trouble. Tessa kept her voice steady. She's just lonely. That's not your concern. Emma stepped closer, and Tessa could smell her perfume. Expensive, floral, oppressive. You're here to clean, not to mother that child, not to fix what can't be fixed. Fix what can't be fixed. The phrase echoed in Tessa's mind like a curse everyone had accepted as truth. If Mr. Hawthorne finds out you've been interfering, you'll be gone. No references, no second chances. Emma's eyes were cold, flat. Think about that. She walked away, heels clicking against the tile like a countdown. Like time running out. That night, Tessa sat on her bed, staring at the wall. Thinking about her mother Sarah, dying in Oakland. The bills piling up. The paycheck she desperately needed. 6 more months of work, and she could afford the transplant evaluation. 6 more months of keeping her head down and following the rules. But she thought about Charlotte too. Those lonely eyes. That pain everyone was ignoring. The dark thing Tessa had glimpsed deep in the girl's ear canal when Charlotte tilted her head just right in the sunlight. Something that shouldn't be there. Something the specialists had missed. Emma's words echoed. Fix what can't be fixed. But what if it could be fixed? What if everyone was wrong? What if the answer was simple and obvious and sitting right there, and no one was looking because they'd decided not to see? Her phone rang. Oakland area code. Hospital. Tessa's hand shook as she answered. Tessa, it's Imani. Her sister's voice was tight, scared. Mama's getting worse. They're talking about stopping dialysis if we can't pay. Tessa's world spun. The room tilted. How much time do we have? Maybe 2 months. 3 if we're lucky. Imani's breath hitched. Tessa, I'm scared. I'm working on it, Imani. I promise. The words felt hollow. Just hold on. I'll figure it out. After she hung up, Tessa broke down crying. Big, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. She pressed her face into her pillow so no one would hear. Let the grief and fear and impossible choice wash over her in waves. She couldn't lose this job. Her mother would die. But she couldn't ignore what she was seeing in Charlotte. Another child suffering while adults looked away. Tessa picked up her Bible, held it close to her chest like it could absorb the pain. Lord, I don't know what to do. I can't lose this job, but I can't ignore what I'm seeing. She waited in the silence. Listened for an answer, a sign, anything that would tell her which way to go. But no answer came. Just the weight of a decision she wasn't ready to make. Just the sound of her own breathing and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the mansion, counting down to something she couldn't see yet. Outside her window, the moon hung low and heavy, casting silver light across the manicured gardens. Inside her heart, a war was beginning, between what she needed to survive and what she knew was right, between saving her mother and helping this child, between keeping silent and speaking truth. She didn't know it yet, but that war was about to end, because the next morning, everything would change. The next morning came cold and quiet. Another gray November day, the kind where the sky pressed down like a weight and the world felt smaller, darker, more difficult. Tessa was mopping the hallway floors near the east wing, her movements automatic, mechanical. Mop, ring, repeat. The rhythm that had become her life. Then she heard it. A soft thud, then nothing. She stopped. Listened. The mansion was always quiet, but this was different. This silence had weight, urgency, something wrong hiding in it. Another sound reached her, muffled, desperate, the kind of noise that makes your heart jump before your brain understands why. Tessa dropped the mop, followed the sound to the sunroom entrance. And there was Charlotte. The girl lay on the floor, small body hunched over like she was trying to fold into herself, trying to disappear into the pain. Both hands pressed tight against her right ear, fingers digging in like she could pull the agony out through sheer force of will. Her face was twisted in a way that made Tessa's stomach lurch, contorted, anguished, a child's face that shouldn't know that kind of suffering. Tears streamed down Charlotte's cheeks. Fat, silent tears that fell onto the hardwood floor and caught the morning light. But no sound came from her mouth. She was crying in complete silence, the way she did everything. Suffering without voice, pain without volume, a 7-year-old girl drowning, and no one could hear her scream. It was the most heartbreaking thing Tessa had ever seen. Charlotte. Tessa ran to her, dropped to her knees, hands shaking so badly she could barely sign. "Charlotte, look at me. Please, baby, look at me." The girl's eyes opened. Red, wet, pupils dilated with pain. She looked at Tessa like someone looks at a life raft in a storm, desperate, disbelieving, terrified it might disappear. Tessa's hands moved, signing carefully despite their trembling. "Your ear?" Charlotte nodded. More tears fell. Her whole body shook. Tessa's chest felt crushed, like someone had reached inside and squeezed her heart in a fist. She forced herself to breathe, to think, to be what this child needed. Her hands moved again. "Can I look? I'll be gentle. I promise." Charlotte hesitated. Fear flickered across her face, raw, primal fear that came from years of experience. This child had been examined by countless doctors, had instruments shoved in her ears, tests run, procedures done, had learned that help usually meant pain, that medical attention came with a price her small body paid over and over. But then something shifted. Charlotte leaned forward, tilted her head, offered her ear to Tessa with a trust that was both beautiful and devastating. This child, who had been poked and prodded by the best specialists money could buy, who had learned to fear the very people who claimed they wanted to help her. This child chose to trust a maid she'd known for less than a month. Tessa swallowed hard. Gently, carefully, like handling something precious and fragile, she tilted Charlotte's head toward the morning light streaming through the sunroom windows. And there it was, deep inside the ear canal, visible now because the light was right and Tessa was actually looking instead of just assuming. Something dark, dense, glistening in the light. A massive buildup, cerumen, probably mixed with God knew what else. Bigger than she'd thought. More severe than she'd feared. Years of accumulation that had hardened into a blockage no one had bothered to look for. Tessa's breath stopped. Her mind spun. How had every doctor missed this? How had specialists who charged thousands per hour, who had examined this child with state-of-the-art equipment, who had access to technology that could see inside a living brain, how had they all overlooked something so obvious? Unless they hadn't overlooked it. Unless they'd seen it and ignored it. Unless Charlotte's deafness was more profitable than Charlotte's healing. The thought made Tessa's stomach turn. Her mind raced back to Imani, her sister at 8 years old, complaining about pressure in her ear. The free clinic doctor who'd finally taken the time to actually look, really look, instead of just running tests and collecting fees. The blockage they'd found, massive, impacted, pressing against her eardrum. The simple removal procedure. 5 minutes of careful work. And then Imani's face when sound came flooding back, when her world exploded into noise and music and her sister's voice sang, "Can you hear me?" Tessa's hands trembled with recognition. This was the same thing. The exact same thing. She pulled back, met Charlotte's eyes, signed slowly so the girl wouldn't miss anything. "There's something in your ear. Something that shouldn't be there." Charlotte's eyes went wide. Hope and fear warred on her face. Tessa continued signing. "We need to tell your father. He needs to know." Panic exploded across Charlotte's face. Her hands moved fast, frantic, almost violent in their desperation. "No. No doctors. Please." More signs tumbled out, unpracticed but clear. "They hurt me. Always hurt. Never help. No more. Please no more." Tessa's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She understood completely. This child had spent 7 years learning that medical help meant suffering, that examinations meant pain, that the people who claimed they wanted to help her only made things worse. 7 years of specialists who saw her as a puzzle to solve, a case to study, a billionaire's daughter whose condition meant job security. 7 years of no one actually helping. Tessa took Charlotte's small hands in hers, looked into those blue eyes swimming with tears and terror, whispered, even though Charlotte couldn't hear the words, "I would never hurt you. Never." Charlotte stared at her. Slowly, so slowly, her breathing began to calm. The panic receded like a tide, leaving fear behind, but not the overwhelming kind. Not the drowning kind. But the fear didn't leave her eyes completely. It stayed there, a permanent resident, a learned response to a world that had taught her to expect pain. Tessa sat with Charlotte until the tears dried, until her hands stopped shaking, until the worst of the pain passed and the girl could breathe without gasping. She held Charlotte the way she'd held Imani years ago when her sister was hurting, the way she'd held her brother Daniel in those final days before he died, when he was too weak to speak, but still trying to tell her something important. Charlotte pressed both palms together. Safe. That sign undid Tessa completely. This child, in the middle of agony, still trusted her, still felt safe with her, still believed that Tessa was different from all the others who'd failed her. Eventually, when Charlotte's breathing evened out and the immediate crisis passed, Tessa helped her to the sofa, made sure she was comfortable, then walked back into the hallway, mind spinning like a carousel she couldn't stop. She knew what she'd seen, knew exactly what it was. A cerumen impaction, severe, probably mixed with fluid buildup and possible fungal growth. The kind of blockage that could cause conductive hearing loss, that could steal a child's hearing not because of genetics or fate or divine punishment, but because of simple, fixable, human negligence. She knew what it meant. Charlotte might not be permanently deaf. The specialists might have been wrong or lying. This might be something that could be fixed with a simple procedure, with willing hands and basic tools, and someone who actually cared more about helping than billing. But what could she do? Tell Julian? He'd call more specialists. The same ones who'd missed this for years. Or maybe they hadn't missed it. Maybe they'd seen it and left it there, kept it hidden, because a cured patient is a lost revenue stream. Either way, telling Julian meant more examinations, more trauma for Charlotte, more of the same cycle that had been failing this child her entire life. Do nothing. Watch Charlotte suffer in silence. Stand by while pain built and built until what? Until the infection spread? Until permanent damage set in? Until this child learned once and for all that no one would help her, that she was truly alone? The weight of the decision crushed Tessa, made her knees weak, made her want to run back to Oakland, back to her mother, back to a life where she wasn't responsible for impossible choices. That night, Tessa didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as clouds passed over the moon. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head, words from years ago, spoken over kitchen tables and during late-night prayers when life felt too hard to bear. God doesn't always send help in fancy packages, baby girl. Sometimes he sends it through folks with nothing but willing hands. Tessa closed her eyes, pressed her palms together the way Charlotte did. Safe. Her hands were willing. God knew they were willing. But was she brave enough to use them? Brave enough to risk everything, her job, her mother's treatment, her entire future, on the belief that she could help where everyone else had failed? She didn't know, didn't have an answer. Just the weight of the question and the darkness of the room and the memory of Charlotte's face twisted in agony. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, Tessa's war continued. And somewhere in the mansion, a little girl slept fitfully, her ear throbbing with pain no one could fix. Or maybe someone could. Maybe someone would. If she was brave enough. If faith was stronger than fear. If tomorrow came, and she was still willing to use her hands. 3 days passed. 3 days that felt like 3 years. Tessa couldn't eat. Food tasted like ash in her mouth, turned her stomach before she could swallow. Couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. That dark mass lodged deep in Charlotte's ear canal, blocking everything, stealing sound, causing pain that no one else seemed to notice or care about. And she saw Charlotte's face, twisted in agony, tears streaming down in silence. A 7-year-old girl suffering while the world looked away. The knowledge was killing her, eating her alive from the inside out. On the third night, Tessa sat on the edge of her bed, Bible open in her lap. She'd been staring at the same page for an hour, but the words blurred, ran together like ink and water. All she could see was Imani, her sister at 8 years old, touching her ear the same way Charlotte did, complaining about pressure, about pain, about sounds getting dimmer. 6 years Imani lived like that. 6 years of free clinic doctors who ran quick exams and sent them home with prescriptions they couldn't afford. 6 years of being written off, dismissed, told to accept what couldn't be changed. Until finally, one doctor, an older woman who'd seen everything and still gave a damn, actually looked. Really looked. Found the blockage. Removed it in one careful procedure that took maybe 5 minutes. And Imani's world exploded into sound. Tessa remembered her sister's face. The wonder. The joy. The tears of relief when music came flooding back. When she could hear her own voice again. When the world stopped being muffled and distant and returned to full volume. One procedure. One moment of someone actually paying attention. That's all it had taken. Tessa's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She pressed them together, tried to steady them, but they trembled like leaves in a storm. She knew what she'd seen in Charlotte's ear. Knew exactly what it was. Knew how to remove it. She'd watched it done, had helped care for Imani afterward, had learned the signs of infection versus normal healing. But who was she? A maid. 28 years old with no degree, no medical training, no right to touch that girl. If she was wrong, if she hurt Charlotte, she'd go to prison. Assault. Practicing medicine without a license. Maybe worse if something went catastrophically wrong. And if she was right, but Julian found out she'd acted without permission, she'd lose everything. Her job. Her income. Her mother's care. Sarah would die because Tessa couldn't keep her mouth shut and her hands to herself. "Lord," she whispered, voice cracking in the darkness. "What do you want from me?" Silence. Just the ticking of the clock on her dresser, counting down to something she couldn't see yet. And then the memory flooded back. Unbidden. Unwelcome. The thing she tried not to think about, because thinking about it meant living through it again. Daniel. Her brother. Dead at 14. He'd been sick for months, complaining about pain in his chest. Trouble breathing. Fatigue that made him sleep 16 hours a day. Their mother had taken him to the emergency room twice, but without insurance, without money, they'd been given basic exams and sent home. Probably asthma, one doctor said. Growing pains, said another. Tessa had watched her brother fade. Watched the light dim in his eyes. Watched him struggle to breathe, to speak, to exist in a body that was betraying him. Near the end, he'd tried to tell her something. His mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came out. Just like Charlotte. Just like Julian Hawthorne in those final moments. Silent. Voiceless. Unheard. Daniel died in Tessa's arms on a Tuesday afternoon while their mother was at work. Just stopped breathing. Stopped fighting. Let go because the pain was too much and help was too expensive. Later, the autopsy revealed the truth. Bacterial endocarditis. An infection in his heart. Treatable. Curable. If someone had bothered to look beyond the surface. If someone had cared enough to dig deeper, run the right tests, pay actual attention. Tessa had promised herself that day. Promised God over her brother's cooling body. Never again. She'd never stand by while a child suffered. Never let another Daniel die because help was too expensive or too complicated or too much trouble. But this was different. Wasn't it? This wasn't her brother. This was a billionaire's daughter who had access to the best medical care money could buy. This was Julian Hawthorne's child, and Tessa was nobody. A maid with calloused hands and a mother dying in Oakland, and no right to interfere in things she didn't understand. Except she did understand. That was the problem. She understood exactly what was happening, exactly what needed to be done, and exactly what would happen if she did nothing. Tessa closed the Bible. Stood. Walked to the window. The moon hung heavy outside, full and bright, spilling silver light across the manicured gardens. Somewhere in this mansion, a little girl was sleeping. Or trying to. With pain in her ear and silence in her world, and no one who truly saw her. Tessa was the only one who'd noticed. The only one who'd seen. And if she did nothing, that made her complicit. Made her just another person who looked away because it was easier, safer, more convenient. God, she breathed against the cold glass. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Her reflection stared back at her. Tired. Desperate. Alone. But if this is what you're asking, her voice trailed off. She thought of her mother Sarah's words, spoken so many times over the years they'd become part of Tessa's internal soundtrack. The Lord doesn't call the equipped child. He equips the called. Tessa wiped her eyes, made a decision. Tomorrow, if Charlotte showed pain again, she would act. She would trust what God had shown her, trust the knowledge he'd given her through Imani's illness, trust that she was exactly where she needed to be for a reason, even if it cost her everything, even if it meant losing her job, her mother's treatment, her entire future. Some things were worth the risk. Some children were worth saving, even if it destroyed you in the process. She climbed into bed, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Sleep wouldn't come. She lay there staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move, listening to her own breathing. But peace came. Strange, heavy peace. The kind that settles over you when you've decided to step off the cliff and trust that God will catch you. When you've stopped fighting and started surrendering. When you've chosen faith over fear, even though the fear is still there, huge and overwhelming and very real. At midnight, Tessa got up, went to the bathroom, found the first aid kit she'd noticed in the cabinet, took out the tweezers, medical grade, sharp, clean, sterilized them with rubbing alcohol. Once, twice, 3 times to be absolutely sure. Wrapped them in clean cloth, put them in her uniform pocket. Just in case, she whispered to the empty room. But she knew. Tomorrow was coming. And with it, the moment that would change everything. At 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. Oakland area code. Imani. Tessa's hands shook as she answered. Hello. Tessa. Her sister's voice was wrecked, broken. Mama collapsed. They rushed her to ICU. The world stopped. Time stopped. Everything stopped except Tessa's heart, which hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Is she? She's alive. But barely. Imani was crying now, open sobs that tore through the phone line. Doctor says maybe 2 weeks without treatment. 2 weeks, Tessa. Not 2 months. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 14 days. 336 hours. Not enough time. Not nearly enough time to save the money, to secure the treatment, to fix what was broken. I'm working on it, Imani, Tessa said, but the words felt hollow. I'm going to fix this. I promise. After she hung up, Tessa sat in the darkness, phone clutched in her hand. Her mother was dying. 14 days unless Tessa could save enough money, unless she could keep this job, unless she could survive long enough to be the hero her family needed. But Charlotte was suffering now. Today. This moment. And Tessa was the only one who saw, the only one who knew, the only one who could help. Her decision crystallized. Became diamond-hard, unbreakable. She couldn't wait anymore. Couldn't wait for Julian to notice, for the system to work, for doctors to care. Couldn't stand by while another child suffered in silence because the adults in the room were too blind or too corrupt or too afraid to actually help. Charlotte needed help now. And Tessa was the only one who could give it. Tomorrow was coming. And with it, the moment that would change everything. Tessa lay back down, tweezers in her pocket, pressing against her hip like a promise. She prayed until dawn broke, for Charlotte, for her mother, for wisdom, for courage, for God to guide her hands if tomorrow came and she actually had to use them. The first light of morning crept through her window. Gray. Cold. Unforgiving. Tomorrow was here. The next evening came too quickly. Time had a way of racing toward moments you weren't ready for, dragging through the moments you wished would last forever. Julian was away on business. Tokyo. Some merger that would make him another billion. Not that it mattered. The house was especially quiet without him, if that was even possible in a mansion already drowning in silence. Skeleton staff on duty. Most had the evening off. And Emma Stone, stern, watchful Emma, had left at 4 for some family obligation, the first time in weeks she'd taken personal time. Divine timing. That's what Tessa's mother would have called it. Tessa was folding linens in the second-floor hallway, trying to keep her hands busy so they'd stop shaking. Her pocket felt heavy with the sterilized tweezers, she'd been carrying for 3 days. Waiting, preparing. Every nerve in her body was on fire, alert, wound so tight she thought she might snap. Then she heard it. Thump. Different from before. Heavier. More desperate. The sound of a small body hitting the floor with force, without control. Tessa's heart stopped. She dropped the linens, didn't care where they landed, didn't care about Emma's rules or the order she was supposed to maintain. She ran toward the sound, feet pounding against marble, breath coming in gasps. Charlotte lay on the hallway floor outside her bedroom. Curled in a fetal position, small body contracted around the pain. Both hands pressed to her right ear so hard her knuckles had gone white. Her face was contorted in agony beyond anything Tessa had seen, and she'd seen her brother die, had watched her mother fade, had witnessed suffering that should have prepared her for this. But nothing prepared you for a child in this much pain. Tears streamed down Charlotte's face. Silent tears, because that's all she knew how to cry. But her whole body shook with it, tremors that ran through her like earthquakes, like her small frame couldn't contain the agony. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Tessa dropped to her knees beside Charlotte, not caring about the hard marble bruising her kneecaps. She cradled the girl's head gently, so gently, like holding something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. She tilted Charlotte's head toward the hallway lamplight. The dark mass was clearly visible now. Swollen, pressing against the ear canal with pressure. Tessa could almost feel herself. Worse than 3 days ago. Growing. Getting more dangerous by the hour. This was it. The moment. The cliff edge she'd been standing on for days, trying to decide whether to jump or walk away. Tessa's hands trembled as she reached into her pocket, pulled out the sterilized tweezers. They caught the lamplight, gleaming silver and sharp and terrifyingly small for the task they were about to perform. Charlotte's eyes widened when she saw them. Her breath came in short, panic bursts. "Lord," Tessa whispered, voice barely audible. "Guide my hands. Please. I can't do this alone." Charlotte looked up at her. Eyes wide, scared, but God help them both, trusting. Still trusting despite everything, despite the pain, despite 7 years of doctors who'd hurt her and never helped. Tessa signed with one shaking hand. "I won't hurt you. I promise." Charlotte stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached up and touched Tessa's face. Her small hand rested against Tessa's cheek, warm and damp with tears. She signed with her other hand, safe. Tessa's tears fell, landed on Charlotte's hand, mingled with the girl's own tears. "Okay," Tessa breathed. "Okay, I've got you." She steadied herself, took a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deep in the earth. Then gently, carefully, with hands that had stopped shaking because they had to, because a child's life depended on steadiness, she moved the tweezers into Charlotte's ear canal. She could feel it immediately. The dark mass, dense and sticky. Years of buildup, cerumen impaction, severe, mixed with what felt like fungal growth or dried blood or both. The kind of blockage that started small and grew year after year, while doctors looked at scans instead of using their eyes, while specialists billed for consultations instead of actually helping. Tessa hooked the mass gently. So gently. One wrong move, and she could rupture Charlotte's eardrum, could cause permanent damage, could turn this miracle into a catastrophe. She pulled. Resistance. The blockage didn't want to move, had settled into place like it belonged there. Tessa's heart hammered. Her breath caught. "Come on," she whispered. "Please." She pulled again. Slow. Careful. Steady pressure instead of force. And then release. Something slid free. Came out whole and horrible and larger than she'd expected. It landed in Tessa's palm, dark and wet and biological. Years of buildup that had stolen a child's hearing, that had caused pain no one had bothered to address, that had been sitting there all along waiting for someone to actually look. Tessa stared at it. Her stomach turned, but before she could react, before she could process what she'd just done, Charlotte gasped. A real gasp. Audible. Loud. The kind of sound that fills a hallway and bounces off walls and announces that something fundamental has changed. Charlotte's hand flew to her ear. Her eyes went wide, wider than Tessa had ever seen them, wide enough to show white all around the blue. She sat up suddenly, like she'd been shocked, looking around the hallway like she'd never seen it before. Everything familiar had become strange. The hallway where she'd walked 1,000 times now held sounds she'd never heard. The lamps humming with electricity. The distant voice of a servant 2 floors down. The rush of air through heating vents. The world coming alive. Charlotte pointed at the grandfather clock on the wall. The massive antique that had been ticking her entire life. That had marked every hour of her 7 years in silence. Her mouth opened. A sound came out. Rough, broken, unpracticed. Vocal cords that had never been used for speech. A voice that had never heard itself. But real. So achingly, beautifully real. "Tick," Charlotte whispered. Her voice was raspy, unsure, like she didn't quite believe it was hers. Tessa's tears fell freely now. "Yes, baby. Yes. That's the clock. You can hear it." Charlotte's whole body trembled. She touched her throat, feeling the vibration of her own voice for the first time. Her eyes filled with wonder and fear and something else. Something that looked like hope but bigger, brighter, more overwhelming. Her mouth opened again. She was trying, struggling to form sounds, to make her voice work the way other people's voices worked. Her tongue moved, her lips shaped words, and finally, after 7 years of silence, one word emerged. "Daddy." A question. A plea. "Where is he? Will he hear me now? Can I talk to him? Can he talk to me?" Tessa sobbed, pulled Charlotte close, holding her as the girl shook, as sounds flooded her world for the first time in her entire conscious life. "You can hear," Tessa whispered into Charlotte's hair. "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you. You can hear." Charlotte clung to her, then made another sound, a laugh. Rough and unpracticed and beautiful. She heard herself laugh and laughed more, the sound building, echoing in the hallway. The first time she'd heard her own joy. The first time happiness had volume. Then footsteps. Heavy, fast, coming down the hallway with purpose and speed. Tessa looked up. The blood drained from her face. Her heart stopped for the second time that evening. Julian Hawthorne stood in the doorway. Face white as death. Eyes locked on his daughter on the floor. Tears on her face, strange woman kneeling beside her. And blood, red and bright and damning, on Tessa's hands. The joy froze. Reality crashed down like a building collapsing. Tessa realized what she'd done. Acted without permission. Touched a billionaire's daughter. Drew blood. Performed a medical procedure without training, without authority, without any right whatsoever. Julian's expression shifted. Terror turning to rage. Pure, parental fury at someone who'd hurt his child. "What have you done? What have you done?" Julian's voice shook the walls, filled the hallway with rage and terror, and a father's worst nightmare made real. He rushed forward, pushing Tessa aside. She stumbled, nearly fell, the tweezers dropping from her hand and clattering against the marble. Julian grabbed Charlotte by the shoulders, hands frantically checking for injuries, for blood, for damage he couldn't see. "What did she do to you?" His voice was raw, desperate. "Charlotte, what did she do?" Charlotte flinched. The sound, so loud, so sharp, so full of anger, hit her like a physical blow. Everything was amplified now, overwhelming, a world of volume she'd never experienced. She'd never heard anger before. Didn't know this was what it sounded like. Didn't know voices could shake and crack and carry such weight. But then her mouth opened. Words formed, rough and uncertain but real. "Daddy, I can hear you." Julian's entire body went rigid. His hands still on Charlotte's shoulders, fingers digging in without meaning to. His brain couldn't process what it just heard. Couldn't reconcile the impossibility with the evidence speaking to him in a tiny, raspy voice he'd never heard before. "What?" Charlotte reached up with trembling hands. Touched his face, feeling the stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. Tears filled her eyes, wonder and fear and 7 years of silence breaking apart all at once. "Your voice," she whispered. Each word was effort, unpracticed, new. "Is that your voice?" Julian's legs buckled. He would have fallen if he wasn't already kneeling, If Charlotte's small hands weren't anchoring him to this moment, this impossible, miraculous moment. He should have been euphoric. His daughter had just spoken, just heard him. The thing he'd spent 7 years and millions of dollars chasing had just happened in his own hallway. But terror was stronger than wonder. Years of medical trauma, of failed procedures and broken promises, flooded back with crushing force. His eyes landed on Tessa's hands. The blood bright red damming. The tweezers on the floor. The dark mass sitting in her palm like evidence at a crime scene. "Security," he bellowed. Charlotte screamed. Actually screamed. A sound that pierced the hallway, loud and desperate and shocked at its own volume. She'd never made that sound before. Never knew she could. 2 guards appeared instantly, materializing from wherever they'd been stationed. "Get her away from my daughter," Julian commanded, voice shaking. Tessa's heart shattered. "Sir, please listen to me." "I didn't hurt her," Tessa said, words tumbling out fast, desperate. "I helped her. Look." She held out her palm, showing the dark mass. This was inside her ear. This is why she couldn't hear. "I removed it." Julian's face went purple with rage. "You're not a doctor." His voice cracked, broke. "You could have killed her." "No. Please." Tessa stepped forward, but the guards grabbed her arms. "Just look at what I found. Look at your daughter. She can hear. After 7 years, she can hear." Charlotte screamed again. "No, don't take her." The sound stopped Julian cold. His daughter's voice, loud, desperate, real, speaking words he could understand. But the fear was too strong, the terror too overwhelming. Someone had touched his daughter. Drew blood. Performed some procedure without permission, without training, without any right. "Take her to the security office," Julian ordered. "Call the police." Tessa didn't resist. As the guards dragged her away, she looked back at Charlotte. The girl was reaching for her, tears streaming, mouth open in grief that finally had volume. Tessa mouthed the words, "It's okay. You're going to be okay." Charlotte sobbed. Loud, messy sobs that filled the hallway and echoed off the walls. The first sounds of grief she'd ever made. Julian heard his daughter cry, really cry, with sound and fury and heartbreak that you could measure in decibels. It broke something in him, cracked the shell he'd built around his heart. But he was too scared to understand, too traumatized by years of medical failures to see what was right in front of him. He picked Charlotte up, held her close. "We're going to the hospital. Now." Julian drove to the hospital like a man possessed, speeding through lights, taking corners too fast. Charlotte sat in the back seat, touching everything that made sound. The car engines rumble. The radio stations Julian cycled through. Her own voice, saying "Daddy," over and over like she was testing it, making sure it was real. Each time she spoke, Julian's heart broke and healed simultaneously. Joy and terror warring in his chest. He couldn't reconcile them, couldn't understand how both could be true at once. The emergency room erupted when they arrived. Doctors swarmed Charlotte, running tests and scans and examinations. Julian paced the hallway, mind spinning out of control. His daughter was speaking, hearing, responding to sounds. After 7 years of specialists telling him it was impossible, after millions spent chasing cures that didn't exist, his daughter could suddenly hear. It was impossible, yet it was happening. Dr. Michael Jordan arrived within the hour, Charlotte's longtime physician, the one who'd overseen her care since birth. Julian grabbed him the moment he appeared. "What's happening? How is this possible?" Dr. Jordan's face went pale. "Let me examine her." He disappeared into the examination room. 20 minutes passed like 20 hours. When he emerged, his face was grim, and he wouldn't meet Julian's eyes. "Mr. Hawthorne, we need to speak." Privately. He led Julian to a small office down the hall. Closed the door. The silence felt different now, not peaceful, but weighted with something terrible. "Just say it," Julian demanded. Dr. Jordan sat heavily. Slid a folder across the desk like he was handing over evidence of murder. "This is Charlotte's scan from 4 years ago." Julian opened the folder with shaking hands. And there it was, clear as day. A notation circled in red. Dense cerumen impaction noted in right ear canal. Possible conductive hearing loss component. Recommend immediate removal and reevaluation. Julian's blood turned to ice. Someone saw this? Dr. Jordan nodded slowly. It appears so, but there's no follow-up. No procedure scheduled. He pulled out another document. Your account was flagged for ongoing treatment protocol. The words hit Julian like a bullet through the chest. Ongoing treatment protocol. A designation that meant chronic patient, long-term care, continuous billing. A designation that meant profit. They knew, Julian whispered. They saw the blockage and they left it there. Dr. Jordan said nothing. His silence said everything. Your money was too good, Mr. Hawthorne, another voice said, a nurse who'd worked with Charlotte's case, standing in the doorway. Your desperation was profitable. Experimental treatments, consultations, procedures. None of them designed to cure. All of them designed to bill. Julian's hands trembled. All those years. All those millions. All those specialists looking him in the eye and shaking their heads with practiced sympathy. They'd lied. Kept his daughter deaf on purpose. Let her suffer because treating her was more profitable than curing her. And the one person who'd told the truth, who'd actually helped, who'd loved Charlotte enough to risk everything, he'd just had her arrested. Julian stood abruptly, chair scraping against tile. Where are you going? Dr. Jordan asked. Julian didn't answer. He ran down the hospital corridor, fumbling for his phone, calling his security chief. Don't call the police, he gasped into the phone. Don't let her leave. I'm coming. Don't let her go. He burst through the hospital doors, sprinted to his car. Drove back to the mansion with his foot pressed to the floor, mind reeling with the truth. His daughter could hear because of Tessa. A maid. A woman with no credentials, no medical training, just willing hands and a heart that actually cared. She'd seen what specialists missed, or what they saw and ignored. She'd risked everything, her job, her future, her freedom, to help a child who wasn't hers, who she had no obligation to save. And Julian had almost destroyed her for it. He had a maid to find, and a lifetime of apologies to make, and a truth to face about the people he'd trusted, the system he'd believed in, the money he'd thrown at a problem that money had actually caused. The gates of his mansion came into view. Julian didn't slow down, didn't stop until he was inside, running through hallways toward the security office, praying he wasn't too late. Praying Tessa Monroe would give him the chance to say 2 words, I'm sorry. Tessa sat alone in the security office, hands folded in her lap, head bowed. But she wasn't praying for herself. Wasn't asking God to spare her from jail, or save her from consequences, or make this easier than it was going to be. She was praying for Charlotte, that her hearing would hold, that the removal had been clean, complete, successful, that Julian would understand eventually, even if it took time, that the little girl would finally know what it felt like to live in a world full of sound, birds singing, music playing, people laughing, all the beautiful noise that made life worth living. Tessa knew she'd probably go to jail, practicing medicine without a license. Assault, maybe. Whatever charges a billionaire's lawyers could dream up. And she didn't care. Charlotte's laugh, that rough, beautiful, unpracticed sound, was worth everything. Worth her freedom. Worth her future. Worth whatever came next. The door opened. Tessa looked up. Julian Hawthorne stood in the doorway. But he wasn't the same man who'd dragged her away hours ago. His eyes were red, swollen from crying. His face was broken, not angry, not cold, just shattered and reassembling into something different. He looked like a man who'd just watched his whole world crumble and rebuild in the same breath. Tessa. Her name spoken softly, almost reverently, like a prayer. She stood. Mr. Hawthorne, I can explain. Julian held up his hand. Don't explain. Don't apologize. Don't say a word. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate. Stopped in front of her. And then this billionaire, this man who controlled empires and influenced elections and had more power than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, fell to his knees before his maid. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. Tessa's breath caught. Her chest tightened. The doctors knew, Julian said, voice cracking around the words. They saw the blockage for years ago. It was right there in her scans, circled in red, documented. They left it there because my money was too good to cure. Because treating Charlotte was more profitable than healing her. Tears streamed down his face. He didn't bother wiping them away. I trusted them. I trusted credentials and degrees and expensive hospitals. I threw millions at my daughter's problem and never once stopped to actually look at her. To see her. To listen when she tried to tell me she was in pain. He looked up at Tessa, and the grief in his eyes was bottomless. But you did. You saw her. You saw her pain when everyone else looked away. You paid attention when no one else bothered. You loved her when I was too broken to know how. Tessa's own tears fell. I just loved her, sir. That's all. Julian shook his head. No, that's everything. He stood slowly, unsteadily. I've spent 7 years trying to buy a miracle. Spent millions on specialists and treatments and technologies. And God sent one through the woman I hired to clean my floors. Tessa wiped her eyes. God uses the willing, Mr. Hawthorne. That's what my mama always said. He doesn't need credentials or degrees. Just willing hands and faithful hearts. Julian nodded. She was right. They walked back to the hospital together. Julian's driver took them, and the silence in the car was different now. Not oppressive or heavy or suffocating. Peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you're grateful just to be alive. Your mother, Julian said suddenly. The hospital bills. I know why you took this job. Tessa startled. How? Emma told me. After I calmed down. After Charlotte kept saying your name and crying for you, and I realized what I'd done. He pulled out his checkbook, wrote something, handed her the check. Tessa looked down. $500,000. $500,000. She gasped. Mr. Hawthorne, I can't. You gave me my daughter's voice, Julian said. His voice was steady now, certain. You gave her the world of sound. You gave me a second chance to be her father. This doesn't begin to repay that. Save your mother. Please. Tessa sobbed, clutching the check like it might disappear. Thank you. Thank you. They arrived at the hospital. Charlotte was sitting on her bed, headphones on, borrowed from a nurse who'd wanted to show her music. Her eyes were closed, face tilted toward the ceiling. She was swaying slightly, tears on her cheeks. Pure wonder radiating from every inch of her small body. It was the most beautiful thing Julian had ever seen. Charlotte saw them, pulled off the headphones, and ran straight to Tessa. Not her father, not the doctors, but the woman who'd saved her. She wrapped her arms around Tessa's waist and held on like she'd never let go. Thank you, Charlotte said. Her voice was still rough, unpracticed, but getting stronger. Thank you for hearing me. Tessa knelt down, held her tight. You were always worth hearing, baby. Always. Charlotte pulled back, looked at Julian. Really looked at him. Not with the sad resignation she usually carried, but with hope. With possibility. Daddy, she said. I can hear your heart. She reached up, touched his chest. It's beating fast. Julian dropped to his knees, pulled his daughter close. And for the first time in 7 years, Charlotte heard her father cry. Not silent tears, not grief held behind walls, but open, honest weeping. And she understood, not because anyone explained it, but because she could hear the love in those tears. It's not sad crying, she whispered. Is it? No, baby, Julian managed. It's healing. Tessa stood quietly beside them, finally letting herself breathe. Finally believing that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. God had answered her prayer. Not with money or medicine or credentials, but with willing hands and a faithful heart. Sometimes that's all a miracle needs. 1 week later, everything changed. Tessa's mother, Sarah, received a kidney transplant. Julian paid for everything, the surgery, the recovery, the follow-up care. The surgery was successful. Sarah woke up crying, squeezing her daughter's hands, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. Imani called Tessa, sobbing with joy. She's going to live. Mama's going to live. Charlotte's hearing was fully restored. Speech therapy began immediately, and her progress was rapid. Years of pent-up words came flooding out. Within days, she was talking in sentences. Within 2 weeks, she was having conversations, asking questions, learning that voices could do more than just communicate. They could comfort. They could heal. The Hawthorne mansion transformed. No longer a silent tomb, but a home. Music played constantly, Charlotte's choice, Disney songs on repeat until the staff knew every word. Laughter bounced off the walls. Charlotte ran through halls making noise just because she could, delighting in the echo of her own footsteps. Julian stopped working 16-hour days. Started taking Charlotte to the park, to the beach, to concerts and movies, and everywhere sound happened. He watched her experience the world like it was new, because for her, it was. Julian offered Tessa a new position. Not maid, family care coordinator. Help me be the father I should have been, he said. Generous salary, full benefits, her own suite in the mansion. She accepted. But really, she'd become family. An investigation was launched into the medical conspiracy. Dr. Michael Jordan cooperated, provided evidence, testified. Dr. Richard Chun and Dr. Lisa Fernandez had their licenses suspended. A class action lawsuit was filed. Dozens of other families came forward with similar stories of treatments that never helped, specialists who never cured. Julian led the charge. Not about money. About justice. One evening, the three of them were having dinner. Something that happened nightly now, a ritual Julian protected fiercely. Charlotte had been practicing all day with her speech therapist. Suddenly she spoke clearly, confidently. Daddy, Tessa, I love you both so much. She paused, smiled. And I can hear myself say it. Everyone cried. Happy tears this time. Julian commissioned a new family portrait. Charlotte, Julian, and Tessa, captured midlife by an artist who understood that families aren't always made by blood. The painting showed Charlotte mid-sentence, mouth open, joy radiating from her face. It hung in Julian's study, replacing the old portrait. Gabrielle's painting was moved to Charlotte's room, so she could talk to her mother, tell her everything she'd missed. Emma Stone apologized to Tessa one morning over coffee. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I was trying to protect her from more pain. But you gave her everything. They became friends. Emma taught Tessa mansion management. Tessa taught Emma that love is a risk worth taking. 6 months later, early morning light filtered through the mansion garden. Charlotte and Tessa sat on a bench, listening to birds sing. That's a robin, Charlotte said, identifying each sound. That's a blue jay. That's a mourning dove. Tessa smiled. You're getting good at this. Charlotte turned to her. Tessa, did you know you were going to save me? Tessa thought about it. No, baby. But God did. Charlotte nodded seriously. Do you think he sends people to save each other? I think he sends people to love each other, Tessa said. And sometimes that's the same thing. Julian joined them, sat on Charlotte's other side. She took both their hands. Listen, she said. They all went quiet. Wind rustling through trees. Birds calling to each other. Distant traffic on the highway. Charlotte's gentle breathing. The sound of life happening, continuing, healing. I can hear everything, Charlotte whispered. Everything. The Hawthorne mansion had learned its lesson. Miracles don't always come through the front door wearing designer suits and carrying Harvard credentials.
Sometimes they come through the service entrance, carrying mops and prayers and willing hands. Sometimes they come wrapped in desperation and faith. Sometimes they look like a young black woman who loved a little girl enough to risk everything. And in the end, that's what miracles are made of. Not magic, not money, just love that is brave enough to step forward when no one else will. That kind of courage changes everything. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. And don't stop now. The next story is already waiting for you. Just click the video on your screen.